B. Before we begin, I would like to request everyone to keep your comments and encouragement at a respectable level of noise so that we can hear the debate. Without any further ado, debating on the motion that this House regrets all attempts. Judging this round will be myself, Rainey as chair, with panelists Mary, Megan, Jake, and Kurt. Without any further ado, debating on the motion that this House regrets all attempts by the government to create a common Filipino identity, we'd like to call on Prime Minister.
Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, oftentimes oppression is hidden behind a veil of glamorous colors and glamorous words. When a misguided attempt to solidify this nation has led to the oppression of multiple and beautiful identities. When we beg ourselves the question of what is a Filipino truly, opening government's answer is that the Filipino is characterized by multiplicity and diversity, which has been limited and stifled by a privileged few who had the fortune of being born near the Tagalog area or the fortune of being born near the capital. What do we think are the attempts that have classified the attempts of the Philippine government to make a common identity? For example, it's the imposition of Tagalog as the national language and forcing it to be taught in all public schools in this country, regardless of whether they want to speak Tagalog. For example, if you look at the Philippine flag, all the 8 rays of the sun just represent the Tagalog provinces that led the fight against the Spanish, discounting any narrative from any other provinces, like the Gahoy Revolution or the Sultanate of Sulu, which never fell to the Spanish. Or for example, it's even things like the unitary government, which has centralized power within Imperial Manila and has centralized all political and social economic capital within a privileged few. What do we think this debate is about? We think this debate is about a critical evaluation of the past and current attempts of the Philippine government to create a singular Filipino identity. What is our burden? We think it's threefold. First, that the attempts have caused more harm than good in trying to solidify a common Filipino nation. Secondly, that we think that what we would rather prefer on our side are countries like South Africa where there are 11 official languages and the business and laws of these states are written in such, or even things like going to the extent of supporting a federalized Philippines, for example, in trying to create a more localized form of identities for people versus trying to impose a national identity that they or they may not consent to. What is the first argument I'd like to prove to you today? First, that the idea that the common Filipino identity has been a force for division and we think has been harmful for nation building. This is how the imposition works in society. If you talk to any native Bisaya speaker, more likely than not, they will tell you that they prefer to converse with everyone else in the country who is not a Bisaya speaker with English because they feel no affinity whatsoever in practicing Tagalog, or they feel no strong affinity as to why it binds them to their fellow countrymen. It's even in the discussion of how we discussed our history and how it's been very Tagalog-centric, with how we focus with the revolution, with how it's been focused with certain Tagalog figures, discounting any other narrative or alienating any other narrative that comes from any other region when you talk about what makes us our people or when it talks about define our history. Oftentimes, you will not hear of conflicts, for example, of how the Sultanate of Sulu never surrendered to the Spanish, but they were included in the deal, for example, that sold the Philippines to the US. These are things that cause a multiplicity to die out as certain privileged few construct the narrative by virtue that they were fortunate enough to be born Tagalog or that they were fortunate enough to be part of the unitary government. And we think opposition simply cannot argue that we're just arguing for more inclusion, that we're just arguing for more and more diversified history lesson. They have to accept the trade-off that if you want to achieve cohesion, that if you want to achieve a singular identity, you will need to eliminate certain niche causes or you need to eliminate certain diversified interests so that you can find more unity in more general or less specific instances or less specific identities. We think even if you include these other heroes, even if you include these other tales of heroism, they become mere footnotes in the general tale of what it means to be a Filipino, or general tale of what it means to try to aspire for that Filipino identity. Therefore, we think that if you want to be an inclusive nation, you need to make sure that people have a greater effort or people have a greater affiliation with the type of identity that they can create. Because we think identities are only valid insofar as people feel like they've had an active role in trying to contribute to that identity. But we think the current attempts or the current imposition haven't been that reflective. Because what happens is you silence the contribution coming from other regions because you feel like they're too niche, because you feel like they're too ethnic. Just the act of calling Bisaya or any other language a dialect is discriminatory because you don't treat them as the official language, because you don't see them at the same level or equivocation of what a language should be. Yes, sir.
Adrian, within the Constitution, it is mandated that we construct the Filipino language as a synthesis of all Filipino languages, and at Tagalog, clearly the frameworks to make the synthesis are not exclusive in status quo.
No, what we're saying is the attempts to synthesize it has benefited a privileged few and has excluded every other narrative that existed outside the locus of power, which so happened to be the Tagalogs, which so happened to be NCR. Second argument I will bring to you is the idea of how it's been used to silence minorities. First, we have minorities and minority interests in this nation. The first question we need to ask ourselves is who has been wielding this imposition? We think it's always been a centralized power around Imperial Manila who has always claimed that it has always had the interest of the rest of the nation. That whatever happened here or whatever benefit it happened within this area or within this locus of power will eventually trickle down to the rest of the nation. That's why it's always pushed the narrative that you always have to give something up for the nation, even at the cost of your own culture or even at the cost of your own development. And this, we think, has translated to actual political, economic, and social effects. For example, the main criticism against the Bangsamoro identity that it's so divisive towards a singular Filipino identity, that you do not have the rest of the nation's interest at hand. We think it was this imposition by a certain few or by the government who has always had the locus of power between certain privileged spaces, which has allowed for this oppression of certain minority interests, because the singular Filipino identity will always tell you that you do not have our best interests at hand or you're not contributing to the collective. Do we understand that it's not government's burden to you in this debate to provide to you what the best Filipino identity is? But we think, in the comparison of worlds, a better Filipino identity would be one where it's more localized to certain, identities, where it's more localized, where people have more autonomy in trying to determine. So that means, even at the trade-off of trying to create more differences between Tagalogs and the Visayas, for example, at least we think there is more autonomy on our side, at least we think people are better empowered on our side. And we think this is the type of world that we aspire for, or at least this is the type of, this is the more inclusive Philippines that we'd like to push for you in this debate. Because we think on this side, or we think in this type of scenario, people, when they are better empowered to try to contribute to their own identity formation, feel that they are less excluded and feel less resentment and less division towards other members of their race or towards the other members of their nation. And we think this is something that we should get behind, or is something that at least won't solve all of our problems immediately, but is the first step in trying to reach inclusion in places that we have ignored for the longest times. Before I end this speech, I'd like to say to my parents watching the live stream that I love you very much and thank you for sending me to my first debate tournament 6 years ago. For all of those reasons and more, we're very proud to open this grand final. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister. We'd now like to call on the Leader of Opposition.
Identities are created not for the self, but for the understanding that humanity is better off together than it is apart. This is especially true when we look at the Filipino context, who are resilient even at the face of problems, who choose to debate even at the face of a storm. We're not like the rest of the world. We understand that. We're different because our country is still at the transition of having a long way to go. It isn't easy to have a common identity, but that shouldn't stop us from trying. The stance of opening opposition is very simple. We believe that it's celebratory in nature and that it's necessary for every progress and every outcome of government to have if we ask the government to do this for us. What are the characterizations of the Filipino context? Because we think, Asians think, Adrian assumes it's so easy for us to diversify in nature, but it isn't. We have to understand the contextualization of what it is to be a Filipino in status quo, that we're heterogeneous in nature, like we have different cultures. We'll understand that we're divided. But more importantly, we're still currently at the transition. All cultures are not equal in nature, and we think that's why the government has to step in to ensure that we look at them equally in nature. We don't know what their alternative is in status quo, or what they want to do. If not the government, will individuals take it into their own hands, and what will that look like? We'll argue to you later why that's even more harmful, and all the supremacy that they fear are more likely to happen when it's not the government regulating the identities that we're supposed to have as of now. But a few things I want to rebut first that don't quite fit into my argumentation. The first would be the wrong matter that Adrian said, because he told you that the Filipinos are mandated by government to speak in Tagalog. That's not even true. We've already transitioned from that. We already made it more inclusive, and that's why we don't call it Tagalog, we call it Filipino, which is a mixture of different variations of what people speak in status quo. And we're willing to make that transition even further, because we recognize that we're still making attempts, so they can't justify that just because it's weak as of now, it's always going to be weak in the future. Second thing is that they support a federal system, but understand, a federal system can only work when you have a unified identity. Otherwise, there's no incentive for the federalized states to follow the main constitution, which, by the way, Posay fact, is still going to be something that everyone will uniformly have to follow anyway. So we don't think that point stands at the end of the day. And they told us, this is perhaps one of their strongest points, right? It's the fact that we'll have to eliminate certain identities or eliminate certain narratives in exchange for having a common one. We say it's not true, because even as of now, we are still making recognitions that we've done something wrong. All of the facts that Adrian said are only recognized because of the fact that governments are making an active effort to change the history to be more accommodating in nature. But even if, in the worst case scenario, we'll have to leave out certain narratives, we say that's necessary in the short term for us to be able to better allocate them in the future, or better recognize their identities in the long run. We think it's government's burden not just to prove to us all these nice terms, but to show us how these identities will end up happening and how these identities will end up proliferating in status quo. But before I go on to my main argumentations, yes, Kitty.
Isn't the fact that the government is changing now and trying to be more inclusive showing that our previous attempts have had negative effects?
But the motion assumes that we're already making those attempts, so they can't justify that our failures in the past constitute always having failures in the future, right? Of course, we're not satisfied with what the common identity looks like as of now, but we look at the future wherein we will be, and we understand it's only through the government that we're going to be able to get that. Three arguments I want to talk about today. The first would be that it's a necessary starting point for the appreciation of all the different cultures that they wanted to have. Three sub-levels. First, because there needs to be a common understanding of what humanity is. And you can only do that when you can step aside differences and work together regardless of where you come from, regardless of what language you speak, and regardless of what you believe in or what cultures you end up sharing. We think, secondly, that the reason why it's a common starting point is because the only way you can move forward is to understand where your histories lie. Regardless of what our differences are, we all have a common history of being colonized, being oppressed, being the underdogs in the international community. And these are values everyone can rally behind, because it leads us, therefore, to the common goals of being able to be stronger as a nation and being able to achieve everything we set out for ourselves economically, politically, and socially as well. We think you can't have that starting point if you let everyone just do their own thing and let everyone identify on their own, because we think that's more incentive for individuals to go their own ways and not collaborate to reach a common goal in the future. You just fracture the identities further, and we think it's going to be hard to recover from that point in time. The second thing I want to talk about, therefore, is why government? A burden that a government has still not proven is why are we trusting individuals to create identities into their own hands? There are three reasons as to why the government is the most reliable actor in this instance. First, because they're the most collectivized actor, and the actor that's most capable of being able to teach people from different backgrounds all of these different cultures and all of these different identities, right? We think that it's also them who are able better to formulate what a common Filipino identity is, because it's only the government that gets to see all the different nuances in status quo between people in Luzon, Visayas and Mindanao and is able to cultivate the best approximation of what everyone can rally behind. The third thing would be the recognition that comes from government legitimacy. We think the harm that comes from their side is even if you have your own identity and you have your own culture, there's no assurance that you're going to be able to live a proper life with those things if the government is not going to recognize them as legitimate or recognize them as valid and status quo. So that's why we think the government's important. The last thing I want to talk about is why abandonment of all effort leads to more harm than good. 3 reasons once again. The first would be because it creates gaps in understanding. If there's no government regulating what a Filipino is in relation to people in Visayas, in relation to people in Mindanao, in relation to people in Luzon, we think it's more likely for people to be fractured in terms of views, fractured in terms of what the goals of the Philippines should be, whether they should focus economically, politically, or socially. We think it's through understanding different nuances, through a common identity, that we are going to be able to achieve these things. We think as well that everything they talked about in terms of supremacy only happens in their side because if you leave people to identify and create identities on their own, then chances are it's only the majority that's going to be listened to. The same way, we hate how Manila supremacy takes place, but we say Manila supremacy is more likely on their side when there's no government to ensure that people's voices from provinces are heard. We end this, right, by making sure that governments make an active effort to be more inclusive. And the only way we are inclusive is we recognize that the only way we can recognize different identities and different cultures is if we come from a common starting point. For all these reasons and more, I'm very, very proud to host. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. We'd like to call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
In my hometown, Ozami City, we had a spate of mandatory 12-hour blackouts because of a lack of government subsidy for electricity in Mindanao, rerouted to building another skyway in Imperial Manila. And in the darkness of my grandmother's home, illuminated only by candlelight, I was exposed to the reality of inequality and oppression in my own country. What is the real face of a Filipino? Is it a short, brown-skinned man? Is it a Catholic in church? Is it a Muslim with her head covered in hijab? Or is it even me, an ethnic Chinese who still believes in like red, white, and blue and whatever? We think that the face of the Filipino continuously changes, and that what we believe in continuously changes, and what we speak and how we speak continuously changes and differs across everybody. We think their attempts are misguided, that they think the only way to achieve a unified nation is by solidifying all of these into one common Filipino identity. We told you that there are multiple ways to be able to achieve identity, that we need to reimagine the way we view a nation, not just as one that imposes a single common identity on everybody, but one that celebrates the multiplicity that inheres in a Filipino condition. And that is something they were never able to grapple with coming from opening opposition. We begged the next speaker to try and respond. What did they tell us? They told us that we are better off together than not. We think that this happy Hallmark card greeting does not substitute for actual analysis, right? Because they can only argue for social cohesion if it has actually happened. We think that when you consider, for example, the intense resentment of Bisaya speakers being forced to speak Filipino and learn Filipino in the public education system, when it makes it even harder to learn these things in a language that is not their vernacular. We think that my cousins, for example, find it incredibly difficult to have to learn Tagalog epics and not be able to understand and access the literature of their own people. We think that Bisaya speakers find it harder to excel because you need to be able to reach the Tagalog elite standard. But who chose the standard in the first place, ladies and gentlemen? It was a factor of accent, it was a factor of luck. We think the fact that you only learn Florante and Laura as the mandatory thing is absolutely weird, superfluous, when you have the ADMU and you have Davao Dongon everywhere else. Because if you have diversity as a fundamental characteristic of your nation, then you need to be able to celebrate and recognize that and not subsume those identities under this weird common Filipino identity. We think they weren't able to prove the fact that this actually has cemented social division in the Philippines because you always have the people at the margins and the people at the periphery resenting
people at the top who continue to consolidate their social, political, and economic and cultural power over them, continuing to marginalize those on the sidelines. So they can't prove social cohesion. We think on our side, what we do is move towards a more inclusive and cohesive society. Secondly, they told us that, you know what, it's weak now, but it won't be weak in the future. Guys, this is so soft, right? Because this motion assumes regretting attempts. That means they already conceded the motion because they also regret the weak attempts of the Philippine state, right? The question they needed to answer is how will this change? Because Adrian told you that the structures are already against people at the margins. It has always been in the hands of the Imperial Manila and Tagalog elite, right? They're the ones who write your textbooks. They're the ones who are at the seat of government. Duterte, you know, he's from Mindanao, but every other president behind him has been from Luzon and the Tagalog regions, right? We think that the people they needed to be able to prove is the fact that these things will change in the future, when in reality, the control of the social narrative and the national narrative has always been in that of the elite. And if it has been in the hands of the elite, they need to prove that it will change downwards to the people, right? Secondly, they told us, you know what, no, it's about commonalities, it's about a common history of colonization. Look, we think the alternative we provided is localized forms of cultural celebration, because they proliferate now, but they continue to be alienated by this national identity that continues to subsume all of these minorities. We think that this common history of colonization is also false, because number one, it's not common, right? Adrian told you that the Sultanate of Sulu was never colonized, but we never talk about this, right? Secondly, even in the discussion of this common history of colonization, contributions are silenced. In the serialization of Philippine history, it's always about pre-colonial, and then we jump to the Katipunan, and we jump to the American Revolution. You know, the serialization of Philippine history silences the contributions of the minorities. They continue to say it's the Tagalog regions who rose up against the Spaniards. But we think that completely forgets the millenarian revolutions in Visayas and Mindanao as well. So that continues to justify the imperialism of Manila over these minorities, because we were the ones who are the actual heroes, and you never contributed to the success and growth of our nation. But lastly, we think the fact that this common history is used to justify this is absolutely abhorrent and needs to be regretted. And we think that the ability of minorities to be able to say we had a role in this nation as well is completely degraded by the fact that the creation of cohesive identity silences them and alienates them from this narrative. Before we move on, go ahead.
How will your side strengthen cultures without the aid of government? But more importantly, how do you expect these cultures to interact with each other?
So we reroute government efforts to a common Filipino identity, to diverse Filipino identities, right? We think it's about what strategies these governments should take. But why can we not trust the government to create this Tagalog, this common identity, right? Because if it's always in the hands of the government to decide on their own, we think it's bad. Because one, it will always be colored by political agenda. But number two, it will always be towards towards a cohesive, towards one identity that tries to subsume all into one. Because right now, we still have a centralized government, right? We still have a government that is interested in making sure everybody follows them. So they won't care about your cultures, they won't care about your indigenous peoples, they will care about their own politics, right? And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, even the government and the seat of the capital is still in Manila. So guess what? Who's going to control your narrative? It's still going to be Manila. But what is the nuance to the Philippines in particular? Number one, we're an archipelagic nation, which means that a lot of our cultures and identities have formed separately. Our religions, for example, are so separate. But even in our constitution and the preamble, we are imploring to the Almighty God. But you know, we probably still have atheists. Our languages also developed separately. Our culture and history developed separately, particularly because the formation of our nation necessarily inheres diversity, necessarily implies multiplicity. We also think that our coming together as a nation was also a factor of accident. Maybe it was because of colonization, maybe because of other factors like economic trade. But the fact that these things are constructed does not mean that we need to subsume everything and continue to imagine a nation as only one. We think that because precisely of the real characteristics of the Philippines, we need to ensure and reimagine the ways we create national identities, that it does not need to be one, but it can be 7,107. In my final nationals, I am proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We'd now like to call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
gentlemen, the story of the Filipino people is one of fighting for liberation. Regardless of where you came from, we accept that there is a huge amount of diversity. We have different cultures, different nuances, different languages. Actually, there are different words for nation, for bayan, in every single region of the Philippines. But all of them have the same root word, kabahayan, which means home. It means that even though we're all different, ladies and gentlemen, even though most of us here come from Manila, even though there are many people from Visayas who are also amazing, from Mindanao, we all share in the same common fight for our home. And the fact that we've seen so many amazing people in this tournament from all regions have been a testament to that fact. I have 3 very important talking points. Rebuttals will be integrated so I can compare more obviously. The first one is, notice how opening government is out of the debate because they're arguing why bad attempts from the government are bad, right? Not that any attempt, past, present, and future, will always be intrinsically bad as long as they are from the government, ladies and gentlemen. We accept that identities are evolving, but we also have to accept that governments are evolving at the end of the day. And if you take a look at Prime Minister's examples, a lot of them were very, very outdated. For example, Tagalog is the official language of the Philippines. That's a false matter because Filipino to the Filipino government is not just Tagalog, but a combination of hundreds of diverse languages within the Philippines. Their qualm about the Sultanate of Sulu, how it's not recognized, or at worst or at best, they're just footnotes, is also false. Because even in status quo, you recognize now that some of the most important battlegrounds that served as sustained victories against the Spanish colonial government, and the reason why the revolution here in Luzon also got arms and inspired third-grade versions of Kyle Atega, started thinking, wow, these people are so heroic. All of these things, ladies and gentlemen, I got from my Philippine Institutions 100 class, which, by the way, is required for me to take by the Philippine government so that we can understand the inclusive nature of Filipino identity at the end of the day. Without this, without the government effort to make me understand those things, I don't understand why their world will suddenly make everybody more likely to want to learn about people they've never even met, or people who are so far away from them that they might feel are already irrelevant to them, ladies and gentlemen. The Imperial Manila talks about the Imperial Manila argument. What we would say is, under their model, assuming that you focus on the self, on your own region, right, there is no more any incentive to learn for themselves the other kinds of identities, right? But also, if you're taking a look at attempts, right, we accept that there are so many attempts that have already happened. The question that they never answered is, why should they regret all of these attempts, even the attempts that are inclusive at the end of the day? Our burden is not to celebrate all attempts. It is their burden to regret all of them at the end of the day. Historically, according to them, discourse was always monopolized by Imperial Manila. We agree with that, but it doesn't argue why a future, more inclusive narrative from the government must also be regretted. Because if you take a look at the wording of the motion, if you take a look at the meaning of any, it means that even in the future, ladies and gentlemen, you're still willing to regret attempts as long as they're from the government. Which leads me to the second talking point about a dominant narrative. Because the intrinsic problem of the opening government bench is that there is a dominance of narrative. And I have 3 responses to this. First one, all methods create a dominant narrative. Even within the previous speakers, we accepted that we're going to take a look at a diverse identity that's centralized in particular localizations. Within those localizations, you're also going to have dominant narratives, ladies and gentlemen. Assuming that we can even unite under their model, a dominant narrative will always arise. But the difference is, and this is the second response, it is easier to correct imbalances within that narrative when you have a central government facilitating that narrative to begin with. It is because that same government will always be held accountable to the people, even if they're from Visayas, even if they're from Mindanao, who say that I'm not being fairly represented. This is the reason why I won't vote for you, for example, if you don't represent me. This is the reason reason why Duterte is it's part of the reason why Duterte, being a person from Mindanao, is in power right now. But thirdly, what you would say it's worse without the government and government benches, because it allows you to bury those same narratives under their model, because there's no centralized effort to revive those things. So under their model, it's actually more likely that some of these empowering fragments for different regions get lost to history. Before I move on, you.
Okay, please enlighten me. What government attempt to unify the Philippines has actually been successful?
Obviously, different attempts come from many different places within the government. You can start from the media, you can start from the schools, but what we would say is there's so many of the, and also I already gave you a bunch of examples, but what we would say is more of those things are important, and it's important for us to not regret it in order to make sure that in the future you have more of these attempts as well. The third thing I want to take a look at is how interactions between different Filipino identities will suddenly change. Because we accept it's well and good to understand diverse identities, but the question that we pose come from opening opposition is how do you best get to that? The fact is, because we live in a country, right, and we're all part of the same country, it is important for us to understand that even though we might have different cultures, we're both the same Filipino. We're still brothers in arms, and brothers or sisters in arms. And what we would say is, and this is very clear coming from Nina, that they never responded to, that you need to start from a common identity, because it is only through that do you see patterns, ladies and gentlemen, in the fights that you see throughout history, throughout regions. And what we would say is, finding those patterns, finding those points of commonality allow us to understand not only what is common, but also allow us to appreciate the differences between those identities, ladies and gentlemen. Otherwise, if you don't have a point of common understanding, you can't even have a point of understanding where you are not common, right? But secondly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, if you side with their model, it only means that you're going to not be able to aid others when your priority is the self. If you take a look at the concept of a nation, it should be something that is, diverse, but ultimately falling under the same nation, right? But what you would say is, if you're forcing everybody to focus on their own particular localization or their own particular locale, what you would say is it removes the incentive to talk about to help other parts of your country. But what they never answered is the feasibility question. Even Nina pointed out, they never argued why it is more likely that everyone will suddenly have equal empowerment in the eyes of the nation as a whole, especially when Imperial Manila will still exist under their model, ladies and gentlemen. So what we would say is, if the inequality in wealth is still a thing under their model, what we would say is the inequality in discourse they also have to accept under their model. But it is only under our side did we prove that with the centralized government, it's easier to destroy that monopoly. We're very proud of it.
Again, we'd like to remind everyone to keep your enthusiasm to minimum volume. Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Let's now call on the member of government.
I grew up in Visayas. My first language was not English, it was Visaya. So, growing up and learning that through 10 years of basic education, elementary and high school, I had to learn Tagalog. And when I moved to Manila, my Tagalog and my Filipino still did not sound like everyone else. I was seen as lesser because I couldn't speak the national language and I was forced and told that I should have learned it in those 10 years. This is the national identity that this attempt has created. That there is only one superior identity and that is the ability to speak Filipino. Never mind that Bisaya is equally a language as powerful and as diverse as a means of communication, but that attempt is one that silenced me as a Bisaya. What therefore is this debate about? It's clearly a retrospective analysis of all existing previous attempts. So opening opposition cannot come up here and say that, well, we can do better in the future, because the all existing attempts is an evaluation of the things that came before. So everything moving forward are the adjustments because we regret the way that all those attempts have existed. Therefore, closing government will be the first to tell you what the alternatives are. Because we think it's not just about creating a diverse identity, but it's clear that we support things like creating a common goal among Filipinos for nation building. This is not a far stretch because we all want a better life. And this is the model that you see in Canada or in Singapore, for example, that despite having multiple diversity and multiple ethnicities, they all realize that if we all work together in business sectors or whatever sector to create stronger economies and stronger human rights conditions for each other, we are fundamentally better. So all you need to respond to opening opposition is you don't need a common identity as a starting point, you need a common goal. And we think that is something that is not impossible to create. But what else do we support in place of this common identity? It is things like mother tongue education that acknowledges that it's no longer about Filipino, but it's about Tagalog, it's about Bisaya. It's not about an amalgamation, but it's about the specific nuances of these types of knowledge, of these types of languages. But second, note how we also support protectionist policies for indigenous cultures, like Wangod, and how we're trying to keep her alive. So these types of things clearly are a concession from the government at this point in time that the common Filipino identity has led to the death of the culture of Wangod, and it's time that we reparate people for these types of things. What therefore am I gonna argue as an extension? It's two levels. First is that any attempt and all attempt for the government to create a common Filipino identity and shove it down people's throats is unjust and abhorrent in principle. But second, when this has been an ineffective attempt such that it should be rejected altogether. Yes, opening.
If you say that you want a common goal, don't you think that's also impository in nature? What's the difference of the hearts here?
No, because we don't need a common identity like in Singapore and in Canada to have a common goal. We're all just working the same way, so I can still be gay, I can still be Bisaya, and still have that common goal. That's not a debate about identities, it's just a debate about what we're gonna do therefore. But the last thing I want to respond to before I move on is this whole idea that, you know what, the dominant narrative will still exist in place of the government not doing anything. One, obviously, if someone's gonna oppress another minority, the government has to step in. That's why we're trying to step in the Lumads, although not effectively, but it's still an attempt that we support to protect these minority identities. But note how the reason why the dominant narrative exists in status quo is because Imperial Manila has consistently had the tools to do it. Things like access to mass media, things to proper representation in the Senate and the legislative bodies. All of these types of things are inherent to the dominant narrative being able to perpetuate itself. So in the alternative, where we elected Duterte into power in the recognition that local politicians are equally as credible, is the concession that all these diversified nationalities and identities are as important as to be represented in these areas. One, why any attempt for the government to do this is unjust and abhorrent in principle. The worldview that we want you to take a look at is that individuals are granted the ability to create their own identities, and this is enshrined by Human Rights Declaration and what it means to be a human. Because every individual should have the ability to dictate that for themselves. What does the status quo of these attempts do? Note how, no wait, before I go on, what does this mean? So, note how this is a true principle, because the reason why we allow sexual identities and sexual exploration, or even religious identities and becoming a secular state, is the recognition that people should be able to come upon their identities by themselves or by other institutions that is not the government. So it should extend to cultural and ethnic identities. What does the attempt do? It does three things. One, it picks and chooses parts of individual cultures to create that common Filipino identity. So what does that mean? It ignores individual nuances of cultures. For example, the way that a Filipino should talk is different from the way a Bisaya talks or an Ilonggo talks, where there's an intonation and variances. So these are the things that you're expected to erase, or these are the things that are ignored when we get words from these different languages to create that specific Filipino as an amalgamation. So the state arbitrarily selects and determines which is more palatable to everyone, and we think that is abhorrent because identity isn't about palatability, it's about being comfortable in your own skin and in your own practices. Second, so after it abstracts different parts, it shoves it back down people's throats in that amalgamated version. And the Filipino identity means that people are left defenseless and unable to decide for themselves because through constant education, it is just shoved down our throats. So lastly, even if it doesn't erase all of your identities, it makes other identities fundamentally more difficult to perpetuate, to grow, and to develop. How? Because clearly you spend 10 years of 8 hours a day in education that teaches you what identity you should adhere to versus the community time you spend integrating with your community of Visayas and community of Ilonggos, for example. And at that point in time, it's only fundamentally less time compared to what you spend in the classroom, where it's formalized of the creation of that national identity. But even the monopoly of teleseries means it's fundamentally harmful. The conclusion, therefore, is that it is unjust and in principle a government overstep and overreach to do this type of policy. We should reject it. Last, why do you think it has been ineffective? We think that the active rejection now looks like the fact that we are having increased call-outs in protection of the Lungans, or the fact that there is tension between Visayas and Tagalogs. It shows that the unity that opposition promises in a better world does not exist because we've even rejected Imperial Manila by voting Duterte and by voting a lot of local senators and whatnot. But in fact, we think that the attempt in status quo has led people to believe that Manila's problems are the problems of everyone because our identities are hinged on Luzon and Manila, such that the solutions for Manila is the solution for the nation. We think it's time to reject that. I am proud to be Bisaya. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, member of government. We'd like to call on the member of opposition.
Before I start my speech, I'd just like to give a shout out to the people that are watching the live stream. To Mahar Mangas and the boys and girls of Ateneo Senior High School, thank you so much for the support. It's been a blast, and I'm really thankful for every day that you're supporting me. I'll do you proud. The attempt to birth the Filipino did not start with government, nor will it end with them. Rather, it is government that has safeguarded and deposited all the attempts in history by the natives of this archipelago to define being Filipino. When the Spanish regime was in retreat, it was the Katipunan revolutionary government from Luzon, Visayas, and Panay Island that called all the ends of the nation to fight for the Philippines. When the Americans refused to grant us independence, it was government officials like Quezon and Osmeña who went abroad to all nations of the earth to declare that we are a sovereign people. And it is now, when Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao continue to bicker and fight and go at each other's throats to define what Filipino is, it is government institutions that allow the representation of all our voices, hopes, and aspirations to fight for what is Filipino. So notice at the core of all that, no thank you, at the core of the entire House's cases, evaluate states' attempts and interference in themselves. We will talk about, in closing opposition, how government attempt has been able to safeguard the momentum of any and all past, future, and present attempts of Filipino people to create the Filipino identity. So I have one major case, and no thank you, on how the Filipino government has acted as a historical institution to protect the momentum of identity making. But a few responses. Firstly, on the model, or the preferred model coming from member of government to forge a common identity through things like mother tongue and institutions to protect indigenous people. Firstly, that seems to create a bit of tension with the more federalist and more self-deterministic model coming from opening government, you cannot simultaneously defend having maximum self-determination while still finding common goal. But secondly, these attempts already do exist. For example, mother tongue-based instruction is already offered by DepEd and there are 24 languages from as far up north as Ilocano, all the way down to Japacano and Waray. Secondly, institutions like the National Commission Institute on Indigenous Peoples have already existed since the 1990s to be able to safeguard and advocate for people's rights. So clearly, if it is a question of past attempts have already created the institutional frameworks to be able to help these peoples. We do not think government side has given due credit to them. No, thank you. Secondly, the major case coming from member of government that it is an abhorrent in principle because the model allows people to choose and select which languages and cultures to prioritize, and in principle it will not work. Firstly, we reject the premise that has been able to choose and select without any checks and balances. Notice that their national historical markers in many of your regions are not just written in English and Tagalog, but also in your local languages. Or notice that a lot of government institutions celebrate local traditions and festivals. Clearly, while we will engage with the fact that most of the time it has focused on the Tagalog identity, over time as well, there has been pushback from all other regions to celebrate their own languages and their own traditions through the same institution of government that supposedly monopolizes them. No, thank you. But secondly, on comparison, if we were to go for a weaker government and a more federalist government, what then is their check and balance against more monopolists and oligarchic power that will be more likely to control the discourse because they are the ones with the greatest powers within those regions? We need to have access to a national network of narratives and resources because those are the ones that allow us to see if we can abandon or accept certain traditions and certain political dynasties within our regions because we can see other people's struggles in our own languages, other people's aspirations in their own languages, and see how they fight. So in comparison, clearly if they want to have a more balanced comparison of all the attempts, then they have to recognize all the institutional achievements that we have been able to make in the past and all the pushbacks that we've been able to make through those institutions. Before I go to the case opening.
The Imperial Manileño government will exist on either side. At least on our side, they won't have power over you because your localized government can have your own regional textbooks, your own celebrated artists, and your own cultural holidays.
Number one, we reject the premise that it has been only Imperial Manila that has held the highest power. Notice that from the 1950s onward, it has not only been a Luzonese president, but also a Visayan president or vice president that has held the power in balance. There is a way for us to control the power. But secondly, because of pushback on a local level, no thank you, we are able to get that representation. Anyway, they have to see where this trend of grassroots movements is not going to work. Let's go to the case. Why do we think that it's a historical institution to protect the momentum of identity making? We assert that the struggles to create a Filipino identity over history have suffered from three common problems: resources, popularity, and time. Resources, because we do admit some regions are made richer or poorer by its natural resources and its historical development as a center or periphery by both political, private, and public forces. Popularity, because of regionalism or just the overwhelming need to survive, people of ethnic groups have turned on each other again and again to be able to protect their own interests. So we will engage with the harm of the historical problems of the Tagalog. But lastly, time. People die, and sometimes they will die before their efforts are able to reach fruition, before their lessons are ever absorbed by the young. So how is it that all these problems to prevent momentum and prevent direction in historical narratives over time have been prevented instead by the government? Three levels. Firstly, the Philippine state has been able to fight for the redistribution of political and economic powers across its islands. Projects like the Cordillera Administrative Region, the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, and currently the Bangsamoro Project came to light because the popular will of the people had an institution that they could compel others they will never meet, and they could never meet to listen to them through the Congress, to the Senate, and all other government agencies to be listened to. While we do admit right now that access is not as equitable as we would like, clearly the ability to have been pushed back by these poorer regions means that we're still able to have a chance. Secondly, no thank you. The Philippine state has synthesized the ever-changing aspirations of people into a common network. By continuously changing national history, by accommodating all those revolts that we mentioned earlier into our national textbook and our national markers and the national language, we are able to create a template narrative of history to draw and parallel all aspirations, no matter how conflicting they are, with different ethnic groups and different regions. But lastly, the Philippine Philippine government gives us a sense of direction across generations. Because of the construction and safeguarding of history, through things like our schools, our national museums, our archives, we are able to make a deposit of all the successes and failures of the Filipino people and its state. It gives people the tools to determine what we want to reject and what we want to accept in the past. What are the comparisons to conclude this case? We can see that for decades, oligarchs and hacienderos have pulled the strings on how we think and act. But, number one, because of government institutions, we have given the opportunities for leaders across the land to fight back anyway. But secondly, because of government, we have recognized the anger and dissatisfaction of people as a historical anger and not just a one-time anger at Manila. To conclude this, sorry for the spoilers, but to paraphrase something from The Last Jedi, we are what the Filipino people must go beyond. And it's only because of the intervention of government throughout history to safeguard the momentum of all our peoples and all our attempts in history that we can actually continue to fight and believe in what is Filipino. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member of Opposition, Government Whip. Here, here.
When you grow up in Imperial Manila, you grow up in a bubble, essentially sheltered from all the things you think are happening in the Philippines. That you assume that we are a great developed nation, and a lot of the times you don't really notice the problems that tend to happen in the fringes of society, because all the problems that the government tell you happen in Manila, and all the solutions must therefore be in Manila. We have to be able to separate in this debate the attempts of the government to create a common Filipino identity and the attempts of the government to create a diverse Filipino identity, because we think that government opposition side is inherently confused in this debate. Why? Like coming from Benny, he celebrates the idea that we have mother tongue now as programs, that landmarks create multiple language. Opposition side should not just celebrate all government attempts. Their duty is to celebrate those attempts that try to create the common Filipino identity. So his support of the mother tongue, his support of all these things that support multiple languages and markers or whatnot, we think is a concession that these attempts are essentially the right way to go. Two things I'm going to answer in this debate to seal the way for closing government. First, how do we really unify the Philippines? Because coming from the entire opposition bench, the only thing they really seem to want is a commonality, never explaining why that commonality has to be hinged on identity in the first place. All they said is, well, we need something to unite us, we need something to be able to separate our differences, but never why it has to be an identity as the only thing that can really unite individuals. What does that mean with that lack of analysis? That essentially, none of their benefits have been able to be shown to be actually mutually exclusive towards being able to reach their goal. And that's why we think that Papat's extension was so important, because we showed you that it is possible to unite individuals without a common identity, but at the very least, a common goal. Look, the UN is together not because they said all Earthlings should think this way and act this way, but because we have the same intent to survive, to live, and to make a better world. We think that goal means that I don't care what country you came from, or I don't care what language you speak, because we all want to live, we're going to work together. And we think that unity, because we achieve it, and we achieve it better, essentially essentially means we're better off than opposition. Sit down. Second thing, they tell us that without this identity, we're automatically going to get fractured views and gaps in understanding. But I don't think that having a different identity robs you of your ability to empathize with others and to make compromises with other individuals. Yes, I might identify differently from a lot of individuals in this room, but that doesn't mean that if we have a gap in understanding, I'm going to ignore you and impose my own view. That kind of thinking is what the government does, but not what our side does. We say that even in the difference of identity, you can still talk about it with each other, debate about it with each other, whatever you want. But the point is that unity is achievable through compromise. Even if that identity is different, they don't get that unity in the first place. What does that essentially mean for this debate? It means that all these attempts, while misguided, have also been ineffective in being able to establish any of these types of things, but more than that, are essentially value neutral since we're not really going to lead to unity. Yes.
I don't know why you think identity is so one-sided. We aren't stopping or banning local governments from promoting regional textbooks or their own language. We're just making sure they don't forget everyone else in the process. You have no incentive to listen to other regions if you only focus on yourself.
No, you have no incentive to listen to other regions if your goal is to create a common identity, because listening and integrating is in direct conflict with your ability to create commonalities, because that would mean you would have to integrate more individuals into your own thing. So that doesn't help your case. Second issue then, who should dictate the identity of the Filipino people then? Because again, coming from both benches, they say government is the ultimate check and balance, but they haven't proven how it could be, how it has been able to check and balance. All they say is, well, it could be, or that in the future we can probably make it a check and balance, but never why these attempts have been able to check and balance. But more than that, it's not true that the government is one who has checked and balanced, because essentially democracies are run by the majority. So it will always be inherently favor of the greater population in NCR, for example, or the greater population in Manila, meaning that it does not have the incentive to check and balance if those who run for it, those who vote for you to be in power, are centralized in one place in the first place. But more than that, let's engage then with closing opposition. When they tell us, well, oligarchs will take their place and oligarchs will suddenly impose their own identity on you. First, we don't think that's true. There's absolutely no incentive for any of these kinds of individuals to want to have a common Filipino identity with all these individuals, because they don't benefit. They benefit from like getting richer and you going to their malls. But more than that, even if it exists and it's the oligarchs who do that, we say that it's much preferable because it's harder for them to do than a government who can impose and mandate it upon their individuals, upon their education systems, and everything else. So even if they were the ones to exist, we think the harm is more mitigable, because at the end of the day, you, whether you're in Visayas or Mindanao, can still say no. But you cannot say no to your teacher who will fail you if you fail to learn any of these types of things. That's why we think it's far better on our side. Like comparatively, what did we say? We said that the requirement of selecting parts and shoving of that blanket identity upon these individuals is ultimately oppressive, because it means and it makes it structurally difficult for other individuals to be able to access that identity, to access all these benefits that you get from being able to subscribe to your identity in the first place. And the state's ability to arbitrarily assign what should be in the identity and what should not is precisely the reason why it's the state who should not dictate the identity of individuals. It's principally unjust when you say you are lesser because you're not able to have these skills and talents that I just so happen to naturally be born in the right place to exist. But this oppression shouldn't happen and is illegitimate. And I think that's what essentially is so important in this debate, is that the standard for rejection here is on the idea that it's inconsistent with what the government believes is right, that like oppressing people is wrong, that individuals should have basic freedoms. And because it's inconsistent, that we allow you to choose your own identity, whether it be sexuality, identity, and how you like all these other types of things. Why then should it suddenly impose a national identity on you? We think for all these reasons, we're very proud to regret them.
Thank Thank you, Government Whip. To close this debate, Opposition Whip.
The Filipino identity was boxed to a language, a shared space, or some metric of commonality. This has helped people through the toughest and lowest points in Philippine history. But sometimes we forget this. After decades in attempts of self-preservation, we forget these values and we forget what people before us necessarily stood for. CO fights for the continuity of experiences that helps us further build the Filipino identity, and that is precisely why we will take this debate. So, the main question that revolved in this debate is answering the question, what do we need to achieve a common national goal? Is inclusion contingent to a common identity? Coming from opening government, we get this idea that we have social division. That, you know what, we have marginalized people because position of powers are held by people in the Imperial Tagalog. The first thing that I have to say about this is the harm is not exclusive. Even in attempts to be diverse, inherent clashes will exist. Whether it's history, whether it's language. Because even in your side of the house, one language must still be forced to communities because that is how you will be able to communicate with individuals. You cannot say that you expect me to learn 1,000 different languages for me to be able to be diverse, to connect to every other individual. Even in terms of history, inherently, people will place greater hierarchy in what their role in history necessarily was. It means that even if you recognize history in Mindanao or Luzon and their role in defining the government or where the government or state should be held, inherent clashes will exist. This means that you cannot please all cultures. Likewise, you cannot claim all the benefits of diversity and of your proposal without recognizing the same processes that you will be utilizing to achieve those values. That exclusivity and that extent of middle analysis and is an important recognition to understand all their harms is not exclusive, even the harms that we got from closing opposition. No thank you after this part. This is important because recognizing that inclusion is not an absolute value means recognizing that given the inevitability of clashes of culture, how do we reconcile conflict, which is a greater way to assess and make sure that cultures can coexist. And after this part, we say that the prerequisite to this is understanding. Even in your Bangsamoro example, a long and really tiring one, we do not give up because what we recognize is a necessary compromise because they are still part of our common identity, even if we haven't met them, even if we've never been to Visayas or Mindanao. No, thank you. And comparatively, we say yes, this is precisely contingent to the attempts of forming a common identity. Because agreements, for example, with indigenous people made before, there is a greater chances of it being respected in years to come because you cannot expect the same level of affiliation for people you have never met or even historical lapses that you have can exist in your side if you are saying it is diverse. Because the natural instinct of individual is to self-preserve. Because your ability or your openness to other cultures weakens your belief in your own culture. That is why we must force this incentive to be present even if we don't think that was the case for closing government. This is why Ventura was particularly important after this part, promise. This is why Ventura was particularly important in this debate. The tangible extension of common identity only came out from closing opposition when it comes to economic inclusion, communication, or the idea of depositing to history, because you have to recognize that even if it only happened in Luzon, even if it only happened in Visayas, or even if it only happened in Mindanao, economic agenda of the Philippines or political changes in the government all and will affect you. This means that everything that you are defending must be cascading. In order for it to be cascading, there must be a tie back in that common identity or common idea of what the Filipino stands for, what the Filipino experience and got through must be recognized. But before I move on to open it.
Sir, the motion doesn't call that we should abolish depositories like the National Museum, but that we should stop referring to it as the National Museum, which is only accessible to Metro Manila residents and allows Manila to call itself the cultural
That's my problem with opening government. They seem to feel that your attempt to be diverse will automatically mean you will not face the same problems of prioritization, of hierarchy, of necessarily pleasing people to live in your local government. We say that the inherent aspect of you still focusing on where your people are or who you're necessarily representing when you're a congressman of that district or a senator of that specific area still means that you will still reach and experience the same harm that you were talking about. Next, when we got this personal example that came out from personal harm that came out from government side of example of being forced to learn Tagalog, of being forced to learn a certain way, and that affects their culture. But my question is, did that stop one's path to learning more about your hometown? Because even in their examples, even people they were forced to learn the Tagalog, learn Filipino. Our question was, how did those tactics or how did that strategy to create a common language or a common identity necessarily affect others? Because we still believe that even for them, where they come from is primary. What we're defending in this side of the house is the recognition of every Filipino out there that there is more to their well-defined area of where they were necessarily born. Because comparatively, where will their incentive to learn come from if the natural instinct is for self-preservation to occur? Because we think understanding and its value are all prerequisites that must be attributed to closing opposition, because that is where the debate lies. We agree, there will be harms. There will be some temporary exclusions, but the attempts to build a common Filipino identity give us all a reason to come back and remember our roots. Because of all these reasons, I'm proud to boast.